Welcome back to our spring quarter 2021 class, Resisting Satan. Our theme verse for this study is James chapter 4, verse 7. Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Before we begin this week's lesson, I want to take a moment to encourage you to check out our other videos on our YouTube channel, F&K Church of Christ Sermons and Education. You'll find many classes and sermons there, but in particular, I'd like to highlight our current sermon series, Spring of Spiritual Strength. Certainly, building our spiritual strength both as individuals and as the body of the Lord's church will prepare us for resisting the efforts of the devil. As we continue this study, this week we will be looking at the power of temptation. And I want to start out by taking a look at two passages. We'll begin with James chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Now let's take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. This verse is speaking about avoiding sexual immorality in the context of marriage. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, from these passages, what can we say about where temptation comes from? From James chapter 1, we learn it doesn't come from God. He can't be tempted with evil, and he tempts no one. Rather, we are lured and enticed by our own desire. Similarly, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, our own lack of self-control in regard to those desires gives Satan an opportunity to encourage their indulgence. Thus, a great part of the power of temptation lies in our own personal weakness. As Jesus said to his disciples at Gethsemane, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." The flesh is weak. It is vulnerable to temptations. And we may combat that weakness by watchfulness and prayer. We must remain aware. We must remind ourselves of the ways of God and the ways of the world so that we can reliably differentiate between them and ask for God's help as we strive for purity. Note that Christ, in the midst of the greatest stress he had yet experienced, and knowing that more is on the doorstep, was concerned for the preparedness of his disciples to stand in the coming days. Christ understands the weakness of the flesh because he experienced it. He was fully God, but he was also fully man and was not exempt from temptation. As we read in Hebrews chapter 4, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." When we think of Jesus being tempted, we think of the direct temptations by the devil after Jesus spent 40 days fasting in the wilderness. But temptation did not end there. This took place as Jesus was beginning his ministry, and he had not selected his apostles yet. But he tells those apostles in Luke chapter 22, verse 28, "You are those who have stayed with me in my trials." So Jesus knows the weakness of the flesh, but he never succumbed to it. He never sinned. And because of what he has done, because of who he is, we can be confident that we will receive the mercy and grace that we need to stand in difficult times of our lives. That confidence that we are called to does not mean that we can give up being watchful against temptation. That would be going beyond confidence to arrogance. So what sorts of things do we need to be on guard against? In 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, we read, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. and the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. The designations of verse 16, desires of the flesh and desires of the eyes and the pride of life, have long been compared to the temptation of Eve and the temptation of Christ, and seen as general categories for all sin and temptation. The same general idea of the things of the world comes up in the explanation of the parable of the sower, before getting a little bit more specific. Matthew chapter 13, verse 22. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. So here we have the cares of the world and then the deceitfulness of riches. That deceitfulness aspect is right in line with Satan's identity as the father of lies. Let's see what 1 Timothy chapter 6 has to say about riches. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Now, it's interesting here that it's not the riches or money itself that is the problem, but the desire, that misplaced love. Its priorities out of sync with God's will. We can easily be distracted by the possibilities that we associate with wealth and forget about the far greater possibilities with God. Further, wealth can facilitate the indulgence of other worldly desires. It is no coincidence that some of Israel's times of greatest unfaithfulness were also times of her greatest wealth. Paul gave another warning to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Youthful passions could cover a lot of territory, and our younger years can certainly be a volatile time in our lives. But those of us who are older should not dismiss this instruction as not applying to us. That is particularly true in a culture and society that idolizes youth and encourages holding on to it, and especially its aspects that are most susceptible to worldly ways. How often have you heard people being encouraged to pursue their passion, even in the church? This is generally viewed as harmless at worst, but is it something we are called to in Scripture? Far too often, such an admonition is really only offering an excuse for indulging earthly desires. Paul's direction to Timothy to flee youthful passions is also a reminder that resisting temptation is more than just a matter of curbing our actions, but it also involves changing our hearts, purifying them. Consider what Jesus said about adultery in Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Just as with the sin of adultery, we need to avoid not only the practice, but also the idea of sin. If we abstain from something with our bodies but indulge in fantasies of it in our mind, where's the virtue in that? We're just keeping up appearances while rotting away on the inside. We must also guard our hearts against earthly desires for worldly power and position. This is a desire that Jesus' apostles struggled with. Jesus offered them this correction in Matthew chapter 20. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." We find a similar guidance in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Of course, the temptations we've looked at are just a sampling. I should mention here that usually when we think about temptation, we think of a pull to do something that we ought not do. But we can also be tempted to refrain from doing the things that we ought to do. Uh, that is not consistent with the attitude of a servant that Jesus calls us to and himself exemplified. We've seen that temptation begins with our own desires. Satan seeks out and exploits these weaknesses in us. So in order to overcome temptation, we need to have transformed hearts. Proverbs chapter 4 verse 23 instructs us, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." We need to make sure that our heart does not become hardened against God and his ways. We need to be engaged with God in the work of the transformation of our heart, mind, and spirit. He is with us and he provides for us in the fight against Satan and temptation. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 12 and 13 we read, "Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." God provides the way of escape, but we need to ensure that we take it. When we do that, when we follow the way that God provides, the way that he has shown us, look at what results. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, and then verse 12. "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him." No one is exempt from temptation. And temptation can be powerful because it originates in us, in our own desires. And Satan seeks to exploit this weakness in us. But God is greater and provides a way out. And when we follow that way, we grow stronger, steadfast, leading ultimately to the crown of life.